खुद ही को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है, was how Dr. Manmohan Singh concluded his famous 1991 budget speech. Allama Iqbal's Urdu shairi that he quoted is not easily translated, but if one were to try, it would roughly translate as, make yourself so strong that the good Lord will personally ask you, the human being, please tell me what is the fate that you desire. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Poonam, for that introduction. It's a matter of great pleasure for me to welcome my distinguished panelists and all of you in the audience to this panel discussion on looking back to look ahead, 30 years of economic reforms. Though scholars like Arvind Subramaniam have very convincingly argued that reforms began much earlier, I think it's sort of near universally acknowledged that 1991 marked a paradigm shift. A country which had steadfastly avoided markets and embraced the quote-unquote socialist model with the state playing a dominant role in the economy made a decisive shift. Looking back, the four major changes that I would like to highlight: A, exchange rate flexibility, opening up to foreign trade; C, giving up industrial licensing; and lastly, reform of equities market. I wish I could say reform of financial markets, but the truth is that debt markets and banking were not seriously touched in 1991. The other important fact is that in view of the state of the economy then, these reforms were actually announced without any immediate prior consultations or consensus building. One could argue in retrospect that there appears to be or there was perhaps a majority view and perhaps a lot of debate on these issues for the entire sort of decade preceding the actual announcement. But formally, and there's a lot of writing on this, the PM, the FM, the then Commerce Minister, and the then Principal Secretary to PM decided and announced these reforms. I want to recall this fact to draw attention to the process as distinct from the content of reforms, because coming to sort of the present situation, one often hears today that the present system is too centralized and that there are no expert consultations and reforms are not entirely thought through and hence are not yielding outcomes. If one looks at growth rates, even after excluding the pandemic period, and if they were to have been high and comparable with the average of the decade till 2014, perhaps most of us would not be bothered, and one could say that the process doesn't really matter as long as there are outcomes. We have now a situation where outcomes don't appear to be entirely satisfactory in terms of growth, in terms of employment, in terms of private capital investment, and a process that does not prima facie seem inclusive, participatory, or consultative. Perhaps even worse, we seem to be going back on some of these reforms. For instance, clearly there appear to be signs of greater protectionism, shutting off of international competition, and perhaps almost no serious financial sector reforms. Now, to give the present government of India credit where it is due, the constitutional amendments and legislations on GST was an excellent example of cooperative federalism. The Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is a second example. Inflation targeting for RBI through an amendment of the legislation were tough reforms. All these were tough reforms that were carried through. But I think the point of worry is the sustainability of reform momentum. For example, the recent pushback on GST, the pushback on farm reforms are matters which should cause us concern. It is in this background that I would like to commence today's discussion and ask the present Finance Secretary, Dr. T.V. Somanathan, two broad questions, Soma. Whether you agree with this characterization, namely poor outcomes, broken process, unraveling of the reform process that began early in this regime as in 2014, and what are your learnings, if any, from the past reform exercise, and what is likely to be useful going ahead? Now, before you answer, can I just take 30 seconds and add an extra word of warm welcome to you for being present here in the conference room of NCAER? Thank you. And in addition, having known you for a long time, I am very happy for India that you are now the Finance Secretary of India. And I have the privilege of having been your co-author in 2 papers, and may I add, 2 celebrated papers on civil service reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in greeting Dr. T.V. Somanathan, the Finance Secretary of India. And it's now over to you, Somanathan, for about 10 minutes, your response to these questions. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Dr. Krishnan. And I must start by saying it's a pleasure and an honor to be on this panel. For me, it is a bit like a Ranji Trophy player on a cricket panel where we have Sunil Gavaskar, Kapil Dev, and VVS Lakshman. But in another sense, I'm still a player while the other panelists are commentators. So I can look at this in 2 ways. And it's and being a player and a civil servant, I must tell you that the views I express here are both personal and circumscribed. And I will be speaking on my personal behalf and not on behalf of the government of India. And what I say is not necessarily the government's view. So I'll try to answer your 2 questions in reverse order. If I can start with what do I see as the key learnings from the past reform experience, particularly 1991 and all that has happened since. So I tried to put my thoughts to this because you had indicated that this is one of the things that I would be asked about. So when I look back, and if I try to be as broad and general as possible in terms of what is something that is useful for a current policymaker, the sense that I get, or the learning that I take from these reforms, is that what may seem impossible at one time may become feasible later. So I think in 1981, when I was a student of economics, if someone had said in a classroom that India would abolish industrial licensing, have private airports, private telephone companies, and allow residents to remit $250,000 a year abroad with hardly any questions asked, I don't think that would have been considered a serious proposition. It would have seemed very far-fetched, but it all happened in approximately 10 years from then. And similarly, if in 2010 or 2009, if someone had said that government would invert the industrial policy of the 1950s and say that the public sector would completely exit all but 4 strategic sectors, and in those strategic sectors compete with the private sector, might have seemed unlikely. But that was announced in this year's budget. So I think the very broad lesson that I take is that one must not be frustrated by delays. One must not assume that if something doesn't happen, then it will never happen. One must not give up. And I think you need to keep pushing good ideas and pushing them all the time. I'm convinced by our experience that there's actually no Gresham's law in reform, and the bad ideas don't necessarily drive out the good. And I think the good ideas keep surviving and coming back from time to time. So I think that is, it may sound very trivial to the audience, but for people who work inside the system every day, that sense of hope that it is worth trying something, that it's worth pushing the horizon, I think that is both useful to have, and I think it's true. So, but then if I look specifically at the kinds of reforms that we probably need at the present juncture, I think we have two main kinds of buckets of reform, if I can oversimplify a bit. First, I think if we are to set our fiscal house in order and also provide for the many things that governments legitimately should provide, I think we will need to reform some of our subsidies. So farm subsidies, food subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, some of them intertwined with each other, and some other subsidies too. So that's one big bucket of reform. The second, I would say, is that we need to improve the efficiency of public expenditure on education, health, infrastructure. Now, I said I was being simplistic. I'm leaving out a lot of the financial market, trade, and other issues. They are important, and I'm not neglecting them, but I'm going to stick to these because I think these are the core areas where we have the most difficulty in terms of getting things done. Now, if I look at these two sets of things that we need to do, the first set, which is the subsidy reform, food, fertilizer, farm subsidies, these are very difficult politically, but they're very easy administratively. So, I mean, it's administratively very easy to raise the price of fertilizer. It just requires a piece of paper to be signed by 3 people in the government, and the price of fertilizer will go up. But it's very difficult to announce. The second set of reforms, which is improving the efficiency of public expenditure, getting better value for what we spend on education, health, infrastructure, courts, so many things that we spend money on. These are actually very easy politically. I mean, there's almost no political party that says that education budgets must be inefficiently used, or that we should not get good results for the health expenditure that we incur, or that we should actually slow down the disposal of cases in the courts. I mean, there's no political party is opposed in concept to any of these reforms. But these are the reforms that are very difficult to execute administratively in terms of actually getting better efficiency of education expenditure, getting better quality in our schools, in terms of getting health expenditure to be used better, to have better outcomes, to make doctors, nurses, teachers turn up in public schools and clinics. That is very hard to do. It's very difficult to do, partly because it's not something that can be done by the central government alone. It requires collaboration across the range of central, state, and local governments, and which means the number of agents that have to coordinate is much higher. So I see a kind of paradox where we have hard to announce, easy to do reforms, and we keep announcing them but not doing them. And then we have the easy to announce, hard to do kind of, the other way around. The hard to announce, easy to do, which we don't announce. And then we have the easy to announce, hard to do, which we announce but don't do. So this is something that I think is something that people like me have to confront as we go forward. The other dimension that I'll bring in here is that compared to 1991 and the immediate aftermath of that, many more of the things that we need to do now depend on state governments and local governments for their success. These are not things that the center can simply lead by example, or simply, announce a policy or start a centrally sponsored scheme for it to magically happen. It doesn't. And here there is the tension between expecting the center to lead reforms. I mean, the very fact that these questions are posed to me as a union finance secretary in this discussion indicates that everyone expects the center to lead these reforms. And at the same time, we expect states to be highly autonomous, to be left on their own, to make their own political choices, as is appropriate in a federation of this size and diversity. And we also believe So I keep getting this tension. It's part of the job. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a tension that shouldn't exist. It is a tension that should exist and will exist. But so on the one hand, we have people who say we must prioritize health, education, quality outcomes. And at the same time, whatever money you give to the states must be untied. So, I mean, there are tensions between these multiple objectives. They're all good objectives, but they don't necessarily all sit together very comfortably. So the simple point I would make, a rather sort of long-winded answer to your question. The first question is, basically, there is almost no low-hanging fruit now. So, in fact, most of our reforms for someone like me from Tamil Nadu is like plucking coconuts from a very tall tree. And it is a fact that, and I know this coming from Tamil Nadu, that the number of people who are capable of climbing coconut trees, both in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, is declining rapidly. There are not many people who can do it now. And we may have to invent a machine that will help people go pluck the coconuts. So it's not easy to do. And I think, but I think the lessons we have learned are such that I'm still hopeful that things that seem difficult, that may seem even impossible, will actually happen. So I think we have to keep pushing. And I think someday we will see them happen. Now, on your second point on consultation and the process of decision making, I'm not necessarily answering all your specific points on trade. If you have time, I'll be happy to do that later. So on the consultation of experts. So first, I think I want to give you a sort of factual answer, which, because these facts may not be sufficiently well known. So before every one of, at least of the last two budgets that I have been associated with, the Prime Minister has personally interacted with 30 to 40 economists in an open house session chaired by Niti Aayog or conducted by Niti Aayog, where every person got a chance to speak for 3 to 4 minutes and questions were asked and answered from both sides. And this happened before the February 20 budget and before the February 21 budget. And this is not the finance minister alone, this is the Prime Minister himself who was sitting in on both these discussions. Secondly, at the time of the Atmanirbhar Bharat announcements in the months of May and June 2020, the Prime Minister personally sat in on lengthy video conference, 5 video conferences with experts across India and outside India on a variety of subjects, not only economists, I must say, but it was again very wide-ranging consultations which happened. The second point I would make here is that our health and agriculture policy have benefited from a lot of in-house expertise. And having interacted a lot with Dr. Vijay Paul and Dr. Ramesh Chand, who are both members of our Niti Aayog, I would say that I consider them first-rate experts. But it's only if someone feels that experts are only those with Oxbridge or Ivy League degrees and not from AIMS or IARI, then you wouldn't consider them experts. I certainly consider them experts, and they've been closely associated with a lot of the reforms that have actually been announced. And let me look at the proof of the pudding. So we have this new Monetary Policy Committee and inflation targeting system. I believe that's somewhere where the government listened to experts, because that was not designed by the bureaucracy. That was based on an expert set of recommendations. But this brings me to my last and concluding point on this, which is that experts are rarely unanimous. So if I can go back to the FSLRC, which recommended a public debt management agency and which recommended a particular structure for the Monetary Policy Committee, there was another expert, and I don't think anyone would state that Dr. Raghuram Rajan is not an expert. So there was another expert who stoutly opposed both of those ideas. And the government finally listened to one set of experts and came out with a set of policies. So it's not as if experts are not consulted or are not listened to. They are consulted, they are listened to, but they're often not unanimous. And the final call is ultimately that of the elected executive. So I don't think it is a fair charge to say that experts are not being consulted or that there's no process behind the reforms. So I'll stop there since I'm out of time.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Somanathan. It was both comprehensive and candid, and I'm sure we'll have occasion to come back to some of these remarks. And now that we have the viewpoint of the Finance Secretary, who is in the hot seat, handling the economy at the time of a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-century type crisis caused by the pandemic, it's useful to turn the clock back and go to the Finance Secretary, who in a sense started all of this? Maybe for those of us who actually know the details, that needs to be stated a little more precisely. Though he was not the Finance Secretary when Dr. Manmohan Singh read the Allama Iqbal couplet that we started the evening with, it is now publicly known that the famous M document, written in 1989 by the then Additional Secretary of the PMO and kept ready for implementation in the event that Rajiv Gandhi returned to power, that document was in a sense the intellectual basis of the 1991 reforms. The importance of the document lay in the emphasis that it placed on convergence and integration of various separate individual but interconnected elements of reforms, and most importantly, doing them all together. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in greeting Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, or Mr. M. Thanks for joining us today, sir. You heard me talk about the changes in the macro and the trade policies that were ushered in 1991, but that's not what I want to talk to you about. It's going to come as a surprise to you that I'm not sure you recall pages 307 to 342 of volume 3, issue 4 of the December 1976 issue of the Journal of Development Economics. It's a celebrated issue of the journal and a compulsory reading in any development economics class, for it carried an article by the youngest division chief of the World Bank, a young man called Mr. M. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. The article, Inequality, Poverty and Development, those of us who sort of done undergraduation in universities in Delhi, US and UK would recall, this was the Bible for a lot of our development economics sort of classes, and in a sense is the intellectual originator of the idea that redistribution of income in some situations will actually support growth, and there could be situations of low effective demand when it may even become a sine qua non for growth. It's my privilege, sir, to take you back to that article where you said, among other things, and I quote, "The positive impact of education on relative equality appears to be quantitatively fairly substantial." You then went on to say that there is strong support for the proposition that relative inequality increases substantially in the early stages of development, with a reversal of this tendency in later stages. Furthermore, it appears that the process is most prolonged for the poorest groups. Now, looking back 30 years later, will I be correct to say that the farm sector, education, health, governance, state capacity to handle all these were never a serious focus of reforms of your times? They are huge problems today, and the questions therefore I have for you, two very quick questions. Why did you ignore these? Looking back, what advice would you have to offer to, say, TV Somanathan on how to handle them now? And he referred to the state's role and the government of India's sort of position on these. And quickly, second one, given the perception that the government is over-centralized and the fact that I stated earlier, there doesn't appear to be consultations, etc., many of which he clearly rebutted. As the chief of the veterans here, can you tell us what was the process that you generally adopted? You ran this for 7 years, and how would you get reforms through? Focus both on the design and the selling of reforms. Over to you, sir, and you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, KP. It's a great pleasure to be here. I enjoyed listening to TV Somanathan's very comprehensive description of all the problems that a current finance secretary in the hot seat feels. And I mean, he has both my applause and sympathies. You know, to the specific issues that you raised, I'm not going to comment on the issue of whether the government is centralized or not. I mean, I'm not dealing with that, and I don't think perceptions are important. What is important is the policy working, and I think we should focus on that. And I'll try and address those issues a little bit. First of all, I want to disagree with you on the proposition that we never focused on farm problems. If you go back to the reforms, one of the things that was quite categorically said was that reduction of protection for Indian industry would actually favor Indian agriculture, because a high level of protection for industry in effect amounts to disprotection of agriculture. And of course, it also is a penalty on exports. And we emphasize both those points. And sort of we felt that, rather than focusing on all sorts of little schemes, the devaluation of the rupee combined with the shift to a flexible exchange rate would hugely increase the profitability of agriculture, and actually it did. I mean, in the period after the reforms, agriculture did quite well, and also agricultural exports after a while began to grow. So I think we did have a view on farm sector reforms, and I think we addressed a very critical part of the whole picture, though we didn't keep emphasizing it. And I think one of the reasons we didn't emphasize it is that if we had said this to a farmer, I mean, they would have said, that's not what we want. We want a higher MSP, we want greater subsidy on fertilizer, and you're not doing that. As a matter of fact, we raised the price for fertilizer, then slightly went back. But the impact of lower protection and a market-determined exchange rate on agriculture was a very important part of the whole reform process. That's point number one. Point number two, you're right, that on both health and education, they were not at the top of our list. I'm sure if you go and look at the plans of that period, you'll find chapters on each. But I don't remember any very major focus on those subjects. I think that focus came much later, really after Amartya Sen began sensitizing everyone that our performance in education and health was a serious impediment to getting good growth. And then I think the whole emphasis on strengthening primary education, the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, etc., that was much later. Now, on this issue, you mentioned, I think it is important that in 1991, we were able to put together a coordinated, mutually supportive set of key reforms. You mentioned the M document that I produced. I don't regard myself, it wasn't particularly original. I mean, I was only saying over there what other distinguished trade theorists had been saying for a long time. I mean, Jagdish Bhagwati and T.N. Srinivasan, and I see Anne Krieger on the panel, and she contributed to this. So, I was just putting it all together. I think there was one or two other factors. The global situation at that time was one where it was very clear that, look, India just was off the chart. It didn't require too much thinking on what we should be doing. And secondly, the rest of the world had been doing it and doing quite well. And in the East European communist countries, they'd already given up socialism. The Soviet Union did that about 6 months after we started reforms. And China had been liberalizing for the last 10 years. So frankly, it was a time when, from an intellectual point of view, nobody who looked at policy would have said we should strengthen what we are doing. They would have said, listen, there's a very simple agenda and you can do it. Now, it was hugely helped by the fact that it was done immediately after a crisis. And see, the most important thing was it was done by a new government which wasn't responsible for the crisis. It's very difficult to say, I'm afraid we've run into a crisis and now we're going to do a whole lot of different things if you're the ones that caused the crisis. But Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh had nothing to do with the previous 2 years or so. So it was easy for them to say, listen, we've just come on board. This is a complete mess. Our foreign exchange, our foreign credibility is down. We've got to do something big. Now, The limited thing we had to do was to get the IMF and the World Bank support so that it would look as if we had the financial support to keep going for a couple of years. The really bright thing that we did, and I give credit to, obviously, to Manmohan Singh, was the principal architect, and Narasimha Rao, who was actually the political underpinning of that whole thing, that he didn't just try to stabilize the economy. I mean, quite honestly, the economy had been stabilized by 1993. If we had wanted to stop doing any further reforms, we could have very easily stopped, and there would have been stability, and we would have had 5% growth. I think it was a conviction that we really needed to do all these things, which meant that the crisis was used as an opportunity, and we put together a bunch of things that at that time were low-hanging fruit, and we carried on doing it, but in a bit of a gradualist kind of way. I think one of the consequences of this gradualism was that it allowed a lot of time for discussion after the reforms had been unveiled. I mean, you're absolutely right that when unveiling the reforms, we didn't call everybody and said, listen, we've got to do a lot of very difficult things and I hope you'll support us. Dr. Manmohan Singh took on the task of laying it out, but then very extensively debating in Parliament, explaining to people, and we also at the bureaucratic level did it quite extensively. And you know, it was quite interesting because I gave a lot of lectures in Indian universities. I was very interesting that wherever I gave these lectures, I would first have a meeting with the staff, the faculty, in a faculty room, and then go and give the lecture. And you know, invariably, the faculty was totally opposed to the reforms. But after the lecture, I'd asked the students to vote, and 80% of them voted in favor of the reforms. So I think one general thing I would recommend is look at what the young people are saying. They're the ones that have to inherit the future. I think they probably have a better sense of what needs to be done. Now, how does this relate going forward? Let me just continue a little bit. See, I think you made two or three points, and I think it's true that at the moment there are a very large number of ideas that are floating around. For example, I mean, the Atmanirbhar announcement, for example, in May of 2020 or something, it was actually a very broad announcement for an economic recovery package. It was only later that protectionism came into it as part of Atmanirbhar. When it was originally announced, it was really how to revive the economy. And then sneaked into that agenda was a series of increases in customs duties, which amount to, if you like, a reversal of what was done earlier. Now, I happen to think that that's a mistake, and I think we need to discuss that. I hope the government is discussing it extensively with private industry. There are many people in private industry who recognize that opening this window will make us highly vulnerable to constant pressures to raise duties from sectors that need one kind of protection or the other kind of protection. And unless I mean, I can understand that one decides to put in a bit of protection here, but subject to some very clear rules that reassure people that we're not opening a window for everybody to come in and start lobbying. So I think something should be done there. You know, on the issue of what to do now, I think we need to get away from the long list of reforms approach and try to identify what are the critical reforms that are most important given the current state of the economy. And you know, my view on that would be that what is most important in the current state of the economy is to get the banking reforms done. I mean, you're right, KP, that financial sector reforms were part of the agenda, and the easy bits, which is bringing the regulatory stuff in line with Basel norms, etc., that was done. But the more difficult part, which is putting the public sector banking system on a competitive par with private sector banking, that was not done. What is good is that private sector banking was liberalized and they were allowed to expand. But the public sector banks remain under strict government control. And I personally think that that needs to be rethought. I mean, in my view, you want a midway kind of agenda, then the PJ Nayak committee holds out, offers an agenda that would greatly reduce the control of the finance ministry on the public sector banks, and also put the regulatory powers of the Reserve Bank of India on public sector banks on a par with the regulatory powers that they have on private sector banks. Now, I think this is not a politically complex thing. And quite frankly, if the government were convinced they could do it, it's a sufficiently technical thing. Its effects would become evident only over a longer time period. So I would say I would put that high on the agenda. And I would also put, fixing the GST and its numerous problems high on the agenda. I mean, it's a very good reform, and it involved quite a bit of heavy lifting by the present government. You always think that there'll be some glitches, but we've now had 4 years, and there is a sense that some of the problems are being taken care of. But to my mind, we ought to have a system where the GST Council takes a look at a pretty comprehensive agenda of reform of the GST so that it can really be put on a very firm basis. I mean, those I think would be, in my view, the things we should concentrate on. Some of them are not very low hanging, but they're not at the top of a very long coconut tree either. So with a bit of luck, I'm sure that TV can get it done.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. That was a nice looking back to look ahead. After the focus on macro and trade issues and a brief discussion on social sector, it's perhaps time to move to product markets and more microeconomic reforms. Though he was the Finance Secretary during 98-99, Dr. Kelkar, what I want to talk to you about, sir, is the remarkable set of reforms in 2 areas and one major institutional reform idea that you worked on. To begin with, first, as economic advisor in the Ministry of Petroleum during 1982 to 87, and then subsequently as Petroleum Secretary during 94 to 97, you clearly laid the foundations for a world-class petroleum industry in India, complete sort of public sector dominated industry thrown open to private sector in practically all areas, difficult phase of decontrol of prices, and almost all intermediate products completely out of the price control regime is a reform. Sort of those of us, as Somanathan is pointing out, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, these looked completely unthinkable. In addition, I recall, sir, later when you were, I think, in BICP, perhaps the first of the major changes in the drug price control order to decontrol drugs and pharmaceuticals was during your time. And moving ahead, as advisor to FM 2002 to 2004, those famous Kelkar reports on income tax, GST, both relating to policies and administration, all of these clearly in sort of very strong ways define a lot of what India today is. The third subject that I want you to mention, sir, is a report which unfortunately was never made public. It's your report of 2003-04 called, and Somanathan, this will be of interest to you. The report is entitled Ministry of Finance for the 21st Century. It's a very short business-like report, just 20 pages. And as an insider, I had the opportunity to sort of formally handle it. And all of us know many examples of lack of coordination within the Ministry of Finance. I don't want to go into examples, but what you covered was the sort of the grand design issues, moving away from the current expenditure, revenue, disinvestment type structure to a much more coherent, a finance secretary more like the foreign secretary or the home secretary of India, truly a primus inter pares. And the beauty of the report was not only grand in conception, you actually went into details of what kind of a cafeteria the Ministry of Finance should have. I recall it as being an excellent report, given this range of issues, product, markets, taxation, institutional reform. Can I request you, sir, to look back to help us and TVS look ahead? You have 10 minutes starting now, sir, and I'll alert you when 1 minute is left. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. I'm grateful for this opportunity to meet so many friends, and I also see my guru, Professor Anne Kluwer. It's a good way to meet many old friends and one mentors. I heard very carefully outstanding presentation by Finance Secretary and of course Dr. Ahluwalia. And I don't want to add anything on those issues, but you know, I mean, looking back, when I think back, I think in the reform, the politics takes command. I mean, the politics is there's a political masters is really what drives the reforms. I mean, one plays a role of crossing the T's and dotting the I's in terms of technical things, but essentially politics is managed by, and that's where I think the crux is. I'll start with one example which you give of petroleum industry. You know, where we wanted to, when I'm, incidentally, my minister was a very young minister, and he did, perhaps unusual in those days, he interviewed people before he appointed secretary, because he wanted to see what the thinking of the concerned person is. And he was clear in his mind that during his time, he wants to make Indian industry internationally competitive. And this was a sort of mandate he gave me. That's what he wants. And I agreed with him. I said, absolutely right, because and I'll tell you why this concern came, because of, thanks to Montek's reform, the economy started moving. Growth started taking place, demand for energy started going up very rapidly, both because of income and also structural change was coming in a sector where we're moving from non-commercial source of energy to commercial sources. For instance, the use of firewood was replaced by petroleum products, or the diesel engine-driven tractors were replaced with bullock carts. So we had this structural change plus changing economy. And because of this, it was quite clearly seen that we were going to increase our import dependency in very short period of time. And it was also recognized that all the crises in India, macro crisis, really came from oil prices and oil dependency. 70 to 74 and even 80, if I recall, 80, 81, and also 91 reforms, where recently the crisis came from oil sector. So there was recognition, political recognition. This is one we have to crack. And assessment of mine, when he asked me, I told him, Mr. Minister, to my mind, the binding constraint in India's private sector or public sector, because that's where and is monopoly. If you want to really get going, you must, and he wholeheartedly gave political support. And mind you, it was not easy. But the most powerful union that time was ONGC union. And Dr. Krishnan, everywhere, all over the world, the most powerful unions are petroleum sector, petroleum unions. In fact, if you remember 1917, Russian Revolution, it started for the Baku oil fields, because that's where the first strike took place. So the oil being a very, given the nature of the beast, namely truly inelastic demand, that if any problems on supplies completely disrupts the economy. So the ONGC union were very powerful. Of course, he gave full support and he handled the politics of it. Without that, I don't think we could have succeeded in opening up the entire acreage of India, because till then, ONGC had complete monopoly, and they were most reluctant. Same was true about our oil companies. They had complete monopoly, oligopoly, but certain markets are complete monopoly. For instance, entire North India, north of India's Indian Oil Corporation had the monopoly. So even they were opposed to it. So the unions were opposed to it, and it was essentially the political. And that time, I must confess, well, the greatest supporter we had was our finance minister. That time, Dr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister. And he fully supported my minister. So political, I think the politics commands the reforms. If there is no political sort of will, willing to commit political capital, I don't think reforms can take place. So, I mean, one can supply technical help, but the real force comes from the politics of it. And I will give full credit. I will give the other example which you mentioned, Krishnan, about reform of pharma sector. This happened in 1988, when we had 378 drugs were under total price control, including vaccines. In that time, the minister was former Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, Bengal Rao. And he realized that this is not sustainable. Because they were, if you may not remember those days, but people didn't have vaccines for even like life-saving vaccines. People were sort of, the prices were high, quality was bad, and the scarcity. So he gave full support in decontrolling vaccines completely. And he took political risk. He told me that I mentioned to him, he said, don't worry, I will defend in parliament. There were difficulties. But India has become now the largest producer of vaccines afterward because this willingness of politicians to take on. So I think I will give full marks or full thing to our political masters. Or they take because they are the real change agents. Because they take the risks, frankly. I mean, I was not taking the risk when I proposed this decontrol completely vaccines. My salary was there. But it was he could have lost his job, the minister. So I think they are the risk takers. They are the one who takes risks. They are the entrepreneurs. So one lesson in this has, to my mind, which may have some relevance for contemporary times, it is that politics will have to command and take the risk. And building into risk is very important for making any reform possible. The other which you mentioned was the tax reforms. Here again, my minister that time was Jaswant Singh, and he made it very simple. In fact, there's a nice dinner party for my farewell given by Anne in her house. And that evening when I went home, there was a call from Jaswant Singh. He was at time finance minister. And he said, Vijay, what are you doing? And I explained to him that my term is over, I'm coming back to India. He said, no, you must come. You can't go back to Pune because I'm going to settle in Pune. He said, no, come to Delhi. Here's ideas. So I went to see him. And he made, again, only 1 point brief. He says he wants India's tax system as comparable as the rest of the world. He says, today, I don't want tax rates as an instrument tax policy. And mind you, it was this clear, and again, he took on. When we proposed a complete use of tax incentive network, you remember, Krishnan, which increased instantly tax GDP ratio of 150 basis points, the entire income tax department was going to go on strike. And I remember that meeting, Mr. Jaswant Singh said, you go on strike, I don't care. He said, what I'm asking you to do, I'm not asking you to give up your power to enforce the laws. I'm just taking away the work which should be done by machines which are available now, which is mainly computers. So it is essentially the political vision, and Mr. Jaswant Singh's only one-line program. He said, I won't have single income tax rate while I'm Prime Minister, and we will use the tax machinery at par with the rest of the world. That's a simple thing. And he gives complete political support. So essentially, reforms are driven, by, in my view, by the political entrepreneurs or change agents. And only exception I would take Montek out because I think in minimizing his contribution to M document, he was a major change agent and change mover. But many of us others, we really were in a way giving technical support to the political level desire to bring about changes in India in the right direction. So I think I'll stop at that because I thought I would cover all the 3 points you wanted to talk about. product market reform. Oh, third point, which you, if you allow me, I'll just mention this a small report we made on Ministry of Finance of 21st century. Again, here, the impetus came from Mr. Jaswant Singh. He called me, he told me, Vijay, do you know that this Ministry of Finance is not changed since Lord Curzon's time? Because he was a historian. He asked me to look at the old, and then I realized, which is true, that no change has come. The only change came about was creation of Department of Economic Affairs by one half a page note by B.K. Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru. But since then, there has been no change in Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Finance became more and more sort of problematic. So he said, why don't I have a look at it? And that was the source of writing this report. That he said, please think, the other interesting point he made, I'm talking the politics of it. He says now India has become member of G20. Our Ministry of Finance cannot be no less in terms of contemporaneous than any other G20 members. He said, we don't deserve to be member of G20 with present kind of Ministry of Finance. And that was the sort of logic, that was the force he gave us. And we gave a very slim report, and the principle was based on only 2 points, which are very simple points. One is that identify those functions the ministry ought not to doing, which is doing, so delete them. And also identify functions which the ministry should be doing, but it was not doing, and add them. Third was that all the agencies get them out, because her third point was Ministry of Finance is a policy-making body, not administrative body. So entire tax administration should be taken away from North Block. And like the United States, they call what is called, what agency call it? TRS, the tax service, which is totally IRS. So like IRS have a completely independent agency in the government. So that was the logic of that very, very slim report, but it was never even considered, unfortunately, because Jaswant Singh left and successive ministers didn't have probably shown any sense of urgency or desire for making these deep changes in the way Ministry of Finance is organized. So the politics is the key, in my view, for reforms.
Thank you, sir. That was excellent, drawing attention back to the importance of political will. With a little over half of our time for panel discussion behind us, our time machine is now somewhere near 2007-8. India is now trying to come out of the global financial crisis, and there is a recent change of guard in the Ministry of Finance post the Mumbai shootouts. It doesn't look like the most conducive time for reforms. The work of the last decade and a half has led to some financial markets and the coming of age of some new financial sector regulators. But problems in the new ecosystem are also showing up. Writing in 2019 in a series very frighteningly entitled, How Indian Regulators Have Cost You Money. I repeat, How Indian Regulators Have Cost You Money. The Mint quotes some absolute horror stories of how something called unit-linked insurance products, ULIPs, used to be sold, or more correctly, missold to ignorant and innocent customers. It sounds like a trivial issue. Estimates are that something like 1.6 trillion to perhaps rupees 6 trillion, this is the band of the estimation by serious academics, was the amount lost by Indian investors over a 7-year period ending in 2012 on account of just one product missold, which is ULIPs, unit-linked insurance products, and clearly identifiable as a problem of lax regulations. Mr. Chawla, sir, you as FS handled this issue, which we both recall. We, in a sense, failed. We didn't really succeed in what we were attempting. But nevertheless, 2 years later, you got the same finance minister to announce in the 2010 budget something like the FSLRC, the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, which Somanathan also alluded to. Can we all welcome Mr. Ashok Chawla, the FS, who did all this in the classic old civil service style, which is get a team of good experts, provide them firepower, and let them do their work and back them. And if required, do a tactical withdrawal, figure out your strategy. Even if individual battles are lost, go on and fight the war. Can I, sir, request you to focus on those difficult second generation reforms in the financial sector? And more interestingly, the 5 years that you spent after being finance secretary to inject competition in the Indian economy. If socialist India had state oligopolies which were inefficient, the new emerging India is now battling private sector monopolies and market power, which perhaps pose, I think, even higher order economic and political problems. Can you also tell us about the developments these developments, because many of these are sort of work in progress and surely would be useful for us and TVS, and probably will be an important part of the agenda in the days to come. Over to you, sir. 10 minutes now, and I'll indicate to you when 1 minute is left. Mr. Chawla.
Thank you. Thank you, Krishnan, for that very dramatic and effusive introduction. Before I come to the second generation financial sector reform, ULIP and FSLRC, let me quickly run through the situation since we are dealing with 1991 onwards. I mean, it's no secret that the period around that time was one of closed real sector and concomitantly a closed financial sector. And as was mentioned, the only major component in the Big Bang reform of 1991 was that the Office of the Controller of Capital Issues was abolished. SEBI was set up, first as an executive body and then as a statutory body. And one looking back to look ahead, which I can straight away recall, is that I was a part of the Office of the Controller of Capital Issues, the CCI, in the mid-1980s. I was the additional controller. I didn't know that 30 years later I would be in another CCI at the Competition Commission of India. So that's what is really in government looking back to look ahead. But that apart, the securities market in incremental changes kept taking place. The NSE was set up, the NSDL derivatives trading team came in, which were major changes so far as the Indian economy and the Indian stock market were concerned. Insurance sector opened up, banking in a limited way. 10, 15 years down the path of liberalization, it was becoming increasingly evident that the financial sector as it existed was not equipped to respond adequately to the needs of a high growth real sector. More so since the period from the early 2000 to 2007-8 was one where both globally and in India, the growth levels were elevated. So how does one handle a financial sector which is not keeping pace with the real sector, more so particularly in relation to infrastructure financing, where the reliance was either on DFIs and more so on banks. And banks lending for infrastructure, as everybody knows, is not really the best way to go about it in terms of tenor of lending and the tenor of requirement for the infrastructure projects. We also had, many of us would recall at that time, the benefit of the Percy Mystery Committee report on an international financial sector, International Financial Center, which is 2007, the Rajan Committee on inclusive financial issues, which was 2008. And then while all this was going on the positive side, came the financial crisis, the US financial crisis of 2008, which very clearly had a knock-on effect on major economies around the world, and India was certainly not immune. The ULIP controversy that you referred to, and for the benefit of those who may not be fully aware, this was basically a very unfortunate battle between two regulators, SEBI and IRDA, one regulating the stock market, the other regulating the insurance sector. Where should that product fall and who should regulate was the issue. They went to the court since the matter was not getting settled. And the government intervened, maybe with a heavy hand, in terms of an ordinance saying that if there is a dispute between two regulators, the government will step in. They will sort of take charge and decide. Now, in a way, this controversy that you referred to, Krishnan, had a silver lining to it, as many such things have. The Financial Stability and Development Council was set up as a consequence, with the finance minister as the chair. And financial stability, even otherwise, apart from this issue between the two regulators which came up, which led to, was the trigger for this thing to happen. Financial stability was not really high on the agenda earlier because the general perception used to be that if there is macroeconomic stability, if there is price stability, then financial stability sort of gets covered. But the events of 2008 burst that myth. And there had to be necessarily, not just in India, but in the major economies of the world, and with the G20 stepping in, major focus on financial stability. So the FSDC, as I was saying, was set up, and this has been functioning well as a coordinating regulatory body, harmonizing what's going on. And also because as these things happen, the Reserve Bank was not too happy with financial stability having to be moved from their remit to that of the government, so to say. A subcommittee was set up of the FSDC where the governor would chair. So all told, if one looks at the picture 20 years down the road, 2011, and as you mentioned, it was time to look at the entire financial sector architecture as a whole and see what needed to be done. And I must confess, and you know it, Krishnan, that the finance minister at that time was not very much in favor of these kind of, so to say, newfangled ideas. So it wasn't easy to convince him, but then he finally, I think, gave up. He must have thought that, okay, these guys want to do some academic work, let them go ahead. It's not really sort of bothering us politically. So the budget announcement gave this idea of a holistic look at the financial sector, not in parts, because by then we already had 3 financial sector regulators. The RBI had been there for a long time, SEBI, 20 years, IRDA had been set up, and the PFRDA was in the offing. So the idea here was to dive deep into the financial sector legislation with the objective to make it competitive and an inclusive financial sector. And since it was a big thing, we got big names, and Justice Sri Krishnan led this exercise. It led to many, many things which are now part of the architecture. And so one can look back with some satisfaction. It focused on consumer protection. It led to the merger or the combining of the Forward Market Commission with SEBI, realizing and accepting that actually all transactions are financial in nature, whether they are in the securities market or in the commodities market. Inflation targeting, which Mr. Somanathan referred to, arose from this. The Monetary Policy Committee, amendments to FEMA, where the equity capital part moved from RBI to the Government of India. And finally, something which has not happened, government withdrew from that proposal, was the separation of the Public Debt Office from the Reserve Bank. So all this is in the past. Now, as we look ahead, which is critical from today's point of view, there is sufficient maturity in the equity market. Not just in terms of regulation, but in the operation of the equity market. But the debt market still is not that robust. And you cannot have just an equity market and not a debt market, which serves the need of the real sector of business and industry. The bond market, we've been talking of for a long time. Any number of committees have gone into it, but it's not what an economy of the size of India, close to 3 trillion, with ambitions of getting to 5 trillion soon, should be having. We are not there. Second, banking sector, and I think Mr. Ahluwalia very rightly referred to the fact that the banking sector needs a total sort of makeover, both in terms of asset quality and in terms of the way this is handled by, in terms of governance, not just in the public sector, but also the private sector. Then regulatory governance and accountability. This is very important because a lot of powers have been given to the regulators. They are actually doing almost everything. They are both the legislature, they are the executive, they are the judiciary, and therefore how they function and what they put across is extremely important. It has to be well articulated, it has to be transparent, and it also has to have a high degree of acceptability and predictability. With that, let me move on to the other aspect that you mentioned, the competition part. And let me say,
you have a couple of minutes, sir.
Yeah, I don't think I need more than 2 minutes. Competition is a very easy subject, easier said than done. In a way, the seeds of competition regulation were sown in the 1991 reform liberalization process, because when you move from the state control system to one which is relatively more market oriented, naturally the competition principles have to apply. So this went through the process of usual process of an expert committee. At the end of the decade, 1999, the Competition Act in 2002, which became effective in 2003. Now, interestingly, and not many would know this, there was a legal challenge to the act, which delayed the implementation for a number of years. And the challenge was not on on the kind of principles that were embodied in the Competition Act or the architecture of the act itself, but on the fact that since this was supposed to be a body, the Competition Commission would be a body which would give out quasi-judicial decisions and would give penalties. The chair of the Competition Commission should exclusively come from the judiciary. This matter was in the Supreme Court for a number of years, and they gave some guidance to the government, which was accepted. An appellate tribunal was set up, and then the act was finally passed in 2007, and implementation started in 2009 on the enforcement on the mergers acquisitions in 2011. Now, what is interesting is that this would naturally upset business because it upsets the status quo and the way of doing things in the marketplace. But it's surprising that I was told by one of the very senior and well-respected ministers of the government a few years ago that perhaps we brought in the Competition Act a little early. We should have given more time to business and industry to settle down after 1991 and only then brought in the act. The other red rag to a certain extent was the fact that the act also applied to public sector enterprises because it's essentially ownership neutral. So people in the government found it difficult to understand or appreciate that they could be, the parastatal bodies could be doing something wrong. So if we look back over the last 10, 12 years, what has happened and what has the commission done? I think it's done a lot in terms of the breadth of coverage. Large number of cases have been taken up, particularly on the M&A part. But on the whole, the scorecard, I would say, has been mixed. There have been cycles of robust enforcement and also of a kid glove approach in the name of ease of doing business. So the jurisprudence hasn't really built up in a substantial way. And meanwhile, we've got another elephant in the room, which the competition authorities are grappling with all over the world, and that is the digital technology and the electronic part and the electronic commerce. So even before about 10 years have passed, the government set up a review committee, and there is a competition amendment bill which is now in Parliament, which brings in a lot of things. And I think, in my view, it's a little too hasty in terms of trying to rewrite the architecture. One almost gets the impression that there is some kind of embarrassment or an attempt to look at what would please industry and business, and therefore kind of paper over some of the difficult parts. Now, this at a time when not only is the whole fundamental concept of competition in the market economy very important. This is at a time when big technology is posing huge challenges, when world over, including in the US, which over the last 20, 30 years had gone a little soft on competition, there is a pushback, and the president himself has given executive instructions on how to handle big technology. So I think all told, and I'll conclude because I don't have much time, I think all told, it's very important that we let this area play out as it should and as it must. But we'll have to wait and watch what really happens over the next 10 years or so, which will define the contours of whether we are really a market economy with a robust regulatory architecture or one of those namby-pamby kind of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. That was a comprehensive look back, look ahead. I also want to thank all my panelists. And ladies and gentlemen, ancient Indian philosophical traditions recognize 4 types of discussions. They are Samvada, Vada, Jalpa, and Vitanda. Samvada is the discussion between the teacher and the taught, as Sri Krishna Arjuna Samvada, where one is explaining, and there the scope for discussion is only to clarify one's understanding. Vada is a discussion between equals, and the purpose is to settle what is the truth. Everyone comes to the table for discussion with an open mind. Jalpa, on the other hand, is where each discussant comes to the table with a preconceived notion, and so does the other person. And the purpose of the discussion is only to convert the other person to your camp. And the last one, Vitanda, is something we often see in some Indian public television channels, which is only to show that the other guy is wrong. I don't have a viewpoint, but I know for sure that you are wrong. NCAER, historically, going back to Dr. Rakesh Mohan, Dr. Suman Berry, Shekhar Shah, and now under Poonam Gupta, we are firm believers in Vada, and I'm glad that this panel has followed the tradition of WADA, and in the interest of sort of doing WADA entirely appropriately, given that we have about, since we started 7 minutes late, we have 8 plus 7, about 15 minutes as per our original calendar, original program. Can I request, since questions have come up from the panelists to each other, maybe I can request each panelist to come back quickly, maybe in a couple of minutes, 2 minutes each, to respond to whatever you think are important takeaways. There is one question which sort of the various questions that have come, one that I want to draw attention of Mr. Somanathan to, is subsidy reform at central level any more difficult politically than ending automatic deficit monetization? This is one question which you may want to take. Over to you now.
Yeah. Let me answer that first. Yes, I think it is infinitely more difficult because deficit monetization was something that didn't directly affect the public when it was corrected. The effects were hidden, slow, palpable, but not to the public. It was a very technocratic kind of change which had profound effects, but it was not something that immediately the farmer in Patiala could relate to use what Dr. Montek Singh said. But these reforms are ones that farmers even in Tamil Nadu can relate to. So I think it is more difficult. Let me very quickly respond to one of the very important points that I think was made on trade and protectionism and how is Atmanirbhar versus is it protectionist? So I just want to, maybe I'll take a little longer than you've allowed me just on this question because I think it is very contemporary and important. So I think we have to distinguish between the multilateral trade liberalization that happened in the 90s and the early part of the first decade of this century and the free trade agreements that India has signed with particular groups of countries in the last 10 to 15 years. And just to cut a very long story short, I think the evidence is that some of these free trade agreements have had very large trade diversion effects. And because some of the members of these FTAs are practitioners of very adept practitioners of non-tariff barriers, there has actually not necessarily been the benefit side of those FTAs has not picked up to the extent that the import side has. So, and I think the important issue for us now is not free trade versus protectionism. I don't think it is the policy of the government to turn protectionist, but is incremental protection from a relatively moderate rate of tariffs necessary in certain sectors of the economy as a transitional measure for an infant that must grow up? I mean, there are a lot of things that I'm covering there in those sentences, but I know that some of our infants refuse to grow up. But if we can get some of them to grow up, then perhaps there is a case in some areas. And I'll illustrate the salience with Atmanirbhar is that last year in the pandemic, we faced a situation where we realized that we may not be able to supply essential drugs in our system if we rely on free trade, because some of our free traders were either unable or in some cases unwilling to supply things that they were the most efficient producers of. So if the most efficient producer of something is outside your country, but if it's something which you cannot survive without, and if you are sometimes in armed conflict with certain countries, then you cannot afford to be a free trader and say that, look, we go by efficiency. So and again, on the question of RCEP, again, let me just tangentially allude to the regional, comprehensive economic partnership. I'm not aware of too many countries that sign free trade deals with countries with whom they have live armed conflicts. So there are issues here that are not purely economic. There are issues where economics is overwhelmed by strategic considerations. So there's a lot of things going on there. But I would agree with Dr. Ahluwalia that while a little bit of temporary protection to a few targeted industries that have the potential to become winners may be appropriate, the pressures do come up. And I agree with him on the risks. And I think we need to be conscious of these risks and prevent those from becoming, sources of extra profits to domestic industry in the name of whatever. So I think that's a risk. We need to manage that risk. On the banking sector, PJ Nayak, etc., in the interest of time, let me just say this, that the thrust now of the government is to go beyond the position that the public sector banks will remain in the public sector. We've now announced that the public sector banks, most of them will eventually be privatized. Now, saying eventually privatized and actually privatizing them are two different things, but we're actively engaged in privatizing them. And banking is one of those sectors where only a bare minimum of public sector banks will eventually remain. That is government's stated policy. On GST, I agree there's been a difficult early part of the GST journey, but many of the technical glitches, legal glitches have actually been fixed, and which is why you've seen a big pickup in the few months before the second wave. Some of the things that were supposed to be part of the original design, such as matching of invoices between sellers and buyers, never actually took off until about 6 to 8 months ago. But now the systems have been tightened, and the systemic self-policing that was intended to start in 2017 never actually started until about a year ago, and more intensely about 6 months ago. So I think you will see improved revenues, the kind of revenues that we were expecting earlier. Again, on the issues in the GST Council, which you had alluded to, I actually would slightly differ from some of the commentary. I think these are healthy and they are loud but healthy democratic discussions in a federal forum. And I think states have their rights and their interests, and the center has its fiscal constraints. And by and large, the structure has worked. It is not broken, and I think it will continue to work. You will hear noise, as you hear in the European Union when they discuss various kinds of inter-country discussions, but I think the structure is healthy and it will keep working. I fully agree with Dr. Kelkar that politics and the government's commitment to reform is actually the most important thing, more than the contribution of people like me. I think we are relatively minor actors. But what I have found is that it is useful for people like us to keep, if you like, we have this expression, the shelf of projects. I would say a shelf of policies. If you can keep a set of things ready, and then governments periodically have those times when you can actually find a good opportunity to push something. So if you keep those ideas ready, then you get opportunities where the government is ready to accept them. And at those moments, they happen. And I think that kind of constructive opportunism is something that people like us need to work on. I think in petroleum too, I just want to point to a few important reforms that have been done very recently, such as the open acreage licensing policy and some of the improvements to the petroleum exploration policy. It'll take a few years for the actual production to come on stream, but there are some hopeful signs. And lastly, on the debt market, I fully agree with Mr. Chawla that the debt market is not as well developed as it should be, and it continues to be something that is somewhat handicapped by straddling two regulators who look at these things very differently. I'm out of time, so I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I turn to the other panelists, I noticed it's 9 a.m. Where Karthik is, and he's been in these sessions from the beginning, which means Karthik would have got up at 4 a.m. So I think the least we can do, since he has his hand up, Karthik has to be allowed a question.
Yeah, thanks, KP. It's not as bad. It's only 5:45, so I think we made this workable for the West Coast. So let me first, as an IPF co-editor and co-organizer, deeply express my gratitude to the distinguished panel for this discussion. I just had a 1-minute kind of intervention and suggestion for Dr. Somanathan. I think when we talk about all of these policies, subsidy reforms and stuff like that, I think the 91 reforms almost required a big bang element to it so that the opposition could not marshal their forces. But I think the reason we didn't take on farms or some of these other complex things was precisely because the lobbies are so strong that I think even Prime Minister Narasimha Rao said he didn't really have the political capital to take on those sectors. So as we try to take on things like subsidy reforms and things that are so much more complex, I have basically two submissions. One is that gradualism may actually work much better here in the following sense, which is the costs of adjustment are highly non-linear in the change you make. So if you take something like fertilizer subsidy reforms, what I would recommend is announcing a glide path of, say, a 1 to 2% reduction over a 10-year period, which is then balanced off with a DBT so that people can see that this is fiscally neutral and not trying to hurt the farmer, but trying to fix the distortions that come from the structure that we have. So I think these are cases where the building trust is as important as the policy itself. And so that's going to be my second major point, which is whether it's GST changes or whether it's reforms, I think the markets and citizens need a certain process of predictability so that they can optimize behavior and anticipation, as opposed to waiting for what is the next surprise that is going to come. And I think part of the challenge has been that a penchant for big announcements sometimes makes it very, very difficult to plan and prepare. So that's, I think, my broad single principle, which is transparency, gradualism, and predictability in some of these more difficult reforms. And if you do it 1% at a time, perhaps that kind of, with this communication that says this is not about stiffing the farmers, but it's really about helping the transition to more efficient agriculture. We know the water situation is unsustainable, power situation is unsustainable. So that's just my broad submission in how we may move forward in this next wave.
Thank you. Thanks. I'll come back to you. My other panelists, Mr. Ahluwalia, any quick response, sir?
No, it's actually, let's give time to Somanathan because he wanted to speak. And I'd like to hear more of what he says. I didn't follow anything that was specifically directed at me, but if there's something you think I should respond to, let me know.
Sir, Amartya Lahiri wants to know, would it be a good goal to get the government out of people's lives? Has government been the problem? Why don't I turn this question to you, sir?
Well, sorry, is that me or to Ashok? No, I don't share the view. I don't share the view that you should get the government out of people's lives. I think you need to get the government to play the role in people's life, which it is uniquely qualified to do, and not to play all the other roles, which it is singularly unqualified to do and usually mucks up. So I am certainly not of the view that we should get rid of the government. We should just get the government to do what only it can do.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kelkar, sir, any response, any quick additional points that you want to make before I come back to Somanathan?
No, Krishnan, I think I'll also yield to Dr. Somanathan because he has more interesting thing to say. So I'll give floor to him only.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chawla?
Just a quick supplementary to Mr. Somanathan. When one looks at the kind of quasi-protectionist systems which are being put in place, does the government, or do you have any kind of sunset clause or period in mind? Or otherwise, what happens is these things is very easy to get into, very easy to come out of, and we've seen that in stimuluses, in 2008 stimulus, which continues to haunt us maybe even till today in the banking sector. So unless one is pretty clear about when it's going to end.
Thank you, sir. I will just draw your attention to a couple of questions, and I believe Arvind Subramaniam has a question, but before I come to him, there's one question on labor reforms, thinking of the government on labor reforms. And Deepthi Bhaskaran has a detailed question on health, but the essential point is health insurance is not, government did privatize insurance sector primarily to strengthen health insurance, but we haven't got desired results. So it's about what is the sort of big thinking on financing, health financing schemes. So A, labor, B, health financing, and I thought I saw Arvind on my screen. Arvind Subramaniam, do you have a question?
Yes, may I, KP?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is, KP, in the spirit of VADA that you so beautifully described, and to my good friend TV, to help convince us that this government is really very open.
No, I'm not here to convince you about anything about this government. I'm not here representing the government. I'm here in my personal capacity.
Okay, to convince
I'm not representing the government at all.
Or to convince me, TV, that you are very open, and maybe not the government. after listening to the others,
I will not express any view contrary to the government either.
No, the question I want to ask you is, after listening to the others, I mean, what do you take away in terms of what you might do that you otherwise might not have, and what would you not do that you otherwise might have after listening to Montek and Vijay and Ashok and others?
You're asking me what I would do or not do as a result of this panel discussion.
Yeah,
exactly.
Two things that you would do and two things you were planning to do but will not do.
I'm a bureaucrat. I'm very slow. I take a long time to absorb things and then decide what to do. But I'll come back to it at the end.
Yeah, over to you, CVS.
Okay. So first on Karthik, I must say I disagree with Karthik on this fertilizer being something that can be done gradually with announcements. Let me tell you, the 1% announcement is enough to create the trouble. And on this, I must say that non-experts such as the people I report to are much better at deciding what is politically feasible than the experts in this discussion. So I would really defer to my political masters on how to manage the political economy of getting something done which needs to be done. And in this particular case, I would seriously question that Karthik has the expertise to do this better than my political master. So no offense meant, Karthik, but this is the reality of India, and they know that business very well. Let me tell you, they are expert at that. And if they don't know how to do it, then I don't think we know how to do it. So let's be very realistic. Now, on the GST, I would just point out to you that in the last 24 months, there have been almost no GST rate changes, except for a few rate changes that were announced recently on things like, the COVID drugs and concentrators and so on. But there have actually been very few rate changes in the last 24 months, almost none. So it is stabilizing, it is settling down. There were lots of changes in the early months, that's true, but it's not happening now. I think Mr. Chawla's point on a sunset clause, absolutely crucial, valid. I agree with it in my personal capacity. The thing that we have done, and I can point to one concrete thing that we've done, is these so-called production-linked incentive schemes that we've introduced in what we think are sectors where India eventually can be a champion. Now, in every one of them, there is a deliberate tapering of the rate of incentive. It starts at, say, 6 and ends at 2 in the last year. So every one of them has a mandatory tapering where the incentive is higher in the opening years and keeps declining each year till the end. So that's one way. The other ways, of course, are more complex. We have, we don't necessarily announce a customs duty rate in advance. So that is a problem. But I think there is some consciousness of this issue, and but I can't speak for the government. I say that again, but I'm not sure that there is any real tilt towards protectionism. I think it's more towards ensuring that critical supply chains are at least partially available locally, and we don't have to depend on imports for example, the intermediates needed to make essential drugs, on medical devices, on things like that, and on a few other things. But there is a political economy behind it, and it doesn't always work the way that we want it to work. Labor reforms, I don't have much to add to what is in the public domain. So there is a set of labor reforms. They are out there. There's a specific set of proposals. The notifications are awaited. The government is doing what Karthik is suggesting, which is having lots of consultations with the labor unions and proceeding gradually. Now, in terms of health insurance, I think the strategy that the government is following is a sort of omnibus strategy of reasonable expenditure on the public health system, which is the primary health centers, the community health centers, the government hospitals, the district hospitals, the tehsil hospitals, and so on. So that will continue to be funded, and we'll see some increase in funding, decent increases in funding over the next 5 years. But in addition, we have recently announced a proposal for credit guarantees to private health providers who go into underserved districts. So if they set up healthcare facilities there, they get subsidized credit in a sense, because it's guaranteed credit, so the rates come down and it's capped at 7.5%. So you can set up a hospital, and then the Ayushman Bharat scheme allows people to go and access that care, and be reimbursed for certain kinds of treatment. So it is a strategy which is typically Indian. We are neither going the UK NHS way, nor are we going the US insurance way. We have something that has a little bit of both. And as both models evolve, maybe we will end up going more towards one than the other, but we are certainly not going the insurance way as the primary method of healthcare provision. And I think that's about it.
Thank you.
Anything else?
One question, Venkatesh Punjab Kesan, and you can deal with it in half a second. Is there a mechanism in place for the incumbent bureaucrat to lean on previous bureaucrats so that such ideas are available when they are needed? This, I think, happens all the time.
It happens all the time. I mean, this is where the informal networks are pretty strong. That has not been a problem. I've never found previous bureaucrats, not only bureaucrats, experts, people who've worked in government, are usually very ready and willing to share knowledge if you're willing to ask.
I think the problem is oversupply. I don't think it's very often oversupply and perhaps not enough effective demand. But we are close to 9:45 now.
Did I answer Arvind's question? No,
no,
I didn't
not
answer
yet.
Arvind's question. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it'll take me a little time to digest all this, but if I look back, I would say this, for me personally, the protectionism issue is one that I take back as very important. And I think the other issue would be, just give me a second. Banking reforms too. I see the point about the banks that we have, but these are two takeaways for me personally. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Somanathan. Thanks again to all my panelists, Dr. Somanathan, Mr. Ahluwalia, Dr. Kelkar, and Mr. Ashok Chawla. I am very happy that we got together. The purpose of WADA clearly is to nudge the discussion towards agreement. And if you recall, we started with Bata Teri Raza Kya Hai. From there, we seem to be moving towards Raza Mandi, which is Urdu for agreement. Thank you all. It's a lovely discussion. I want to thank each one of you for this lovely and sort of erudite, sorry?
Dick's hand was raised.
Sir, did you want to speak, Mr. Ahluwalia?
No, I was just saying goodbye and thanks to everybody.
Okay. Thank you. So I want to thank all my panelists again for this excellent discussion this evening.